Can you guys see that? Nick? Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
I can hear you just fine.
Hello?
Okay, I see you. Mic system, I just want someone to say something. And
Hello?
Yeah, I can hear.
Yeah, we can hear.
I can hear you in the distant. Can someone say something? Are you guys still seeing me? Can you hear me?
Oh wait, we can.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Hold on.
I can hear everybody else though.
Sorry.
Does anybody have like 2 Professor Petersens?
Yeah.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
I just actually.
One of them is in the age
Oh
of.
yeah, no, I do. Yeah.
And then the other one is I.
No, that's his computer.
Got it.
Oh yeah.
Where'd he go?
Oh, he dropped off entirely.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
he's gone.
Yeah, because I don't hear his voice anymore.
Diana, I like your shaved head. It looks really
Thank
nice.
you.
Yeah,
I got so bored. I just couldn't handle it anymore. Like the second day.
Like right before this, one of my
really
friends was
fun, right?
live stream shaving her head on Instagram.
That's such a good idea. I should do a Zoom live stream. Let's shave our heads together, everybody.
Oh yeah.
I got you.
Man.
All right, am I back up again? Okay. All right. If you guys are ready, I think we're going to go ahead and start with the tour. And because it's such a beautiful sunny day outside, we're going to start this tour outside. Let me just switch my camera and it'll go back to me for a second so you can see me walking out of the building. But part of the reason I chose today as a tour day is because it's just beautiful out here. It's like 60 degrees out here. I'm going to flip cameras for a second so you can see something, which is you can see someone has set up a hammock between 2 of our persimmon trees here. And when I came into the building, they were snoozing in that hammock. So life is still going on out here. And yeah. All right. Well, ideally, we'd be out here together. And it would be nice to be out here together. But not possible given the circumstances. So we're going to try to do the next best thing, which is I'm going to give you a tour of the Adam Joseph Lewis Center for Environmental Studies from my little phone sticking on a stick out here. So I'm turning a little bit. You can see the Adam Joseph Lewis Center stretching out behind me. And as many of you understand, this building has served as kind of an icon and a showcase for the green building movement within the United States. Many people will ask us, well, so what's the LEED rating on that building? So some of you are probably familiar with the Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design rating system developed by the US Green Building Council. It's basically a rating system for the degree of environmental stewardship embodied in buildings. And people will ask, what's the rating on the Lewis Center? And the answer is it's not rated. And that's because it really came into existence before that rating system existed. And in fact, many of the people who were involved in developing that rating system for buildings worked on the Lewis Center as part of the design team. And so part of my point today is to introduce you to the Adam Joseph Lewis Center for Environmental Studies. But really what I want to do is introduce a larger topic that we're going to start talking about the week after next, and that is the field of ecological design. So ecological design is an emerging field that focuses on the key question of how can we redesign human relationships with each other and with the planet in ways that are more sustainable and last over the long haul. So there are a number of really core principles of ecological design in general that I want to talk about. And as I talk about the building, I'll try to introduce some of those. And as I mentioned in my email, Ben Hobbs is also part of this conference. He's our building manager, so he may interject some comments too along the way if he feels moved to do that. But the central principles of ecological design are things we've been talking about in this class all along. One of those is the idea of of thinking about how a given thing relates to larger things now and in the future. So we ask the question, how does what we do in this place affect other places? How does what we do now affect later generations? So this idea of thinking about design in terms of how it fits within the larger world. So that's one key principle, is thinking about that integration part of thing. It's really kind of a corollary of the systems thinking view, is how is this particular thing I'm working on integrated within the larger whole? So that's one key principle. Many of the core principles really come from basic ecology. So the idea that systems should operate on sunlight, on recently captured sunlight. So as we go through this building, I'll talk about the way in which this building behind me, and again, I'll circle a little bit here so you can see it behind me. The way this building behind me is designed to operate on solar energy. So running on recently captured sunlight is crucial. Another key design principle of ecological design is the notion of recycling materials. How do materials fit into larger things? And at the end of the day, this idea of waste, which is so fundamental to our lives, we throw things away in a trash can. Ecological design is premised on the idea that when we get things right, there really won't be such thing as waste. If you look at natural ecosystems, there's no waste in an ecosystem. The output from one part of the ecosystem is valuable input to another part of the ecosystem. And then the third principle, or actually fourth principle of ecological design that I want to talk about when I talk about this center, is also the notion of feedback, designing systems so that there's lots of information flow from one component to another, and that information flow allows the performance of the whole system to be sort of enhanced over time. So again, I'm going to focus on this building, but I want to be trying to draw larger connections with design as a much broader issue than just architecture. Because when we talk about ecological design, we're not just talking about designing human artifacts like buildings. We're talking about designing governments, designing societies, designing the way in which human beings interact with each other. So I think I'm going to flip cameras for a second so I can get more of a focus on the building. Let's hope this works. All right. So now I flipped cameras and I'm going to kind of show you the building as a whole, including I'm right now pointed at the, I'm actually pointed at the guy in the hammock, but also at the solar array just beyond him over the parking lot. And then I'll circle past the building again. And what I want to really emphasize as we look at the building, maybe I'll flip back for a second to my camera, is that when this building was first conceived of is in the mid-1990s, the Environmental Studies Center at Oberlin was sort of this growing entity. The Environmental Studies Department was a growing entity, and basically it needed a larger place. It used to be housed in the basement of Rice. And my colleague who hired me, who's now retired, David Orr, whose article you hopefully had a chance to look at today, Architecture as Pedagogy, was interested in figuring out, could we design a building that actually was fundamentally integrated into the curriculum, in which all of the principles we're trying to teach in our classes are actually manifest in buildings? And if you took a look at that article, one of his central points in that article is that most buildings actually teach all the wrong lessons about our relationship with each other and nature. People inside of buildings are very separate from the outside. They have no sense of connection. There's no information about how what goes on in the building is dependent on what goes on in larger systems. And most buildings implicitly teach the lesson that waste is sort of normal, that things should be designed to be obsolete after some time, and just sort of all of the general problems with our design are manifest in buildings. So the question that he and several classes of students set out to address is, how could we build a building that would be a place not just in which learning occurs, but a building that could function as an integrated central component of the curriculum? And so over several years, and this is before I got to Oberlin, he and several classes of students sort of developed kind of the design program for this building. You know, how can we build a building that doesn't cause ugliness somewhere else or at some later time? How can we build a building that runs on solar energy? How can we build a building that uses local materials and that internally recycles materials? So those are the kinds of things we'll be talking about. And I like to start back here across from the building to make the point that even then, folks were thinking about the building as part of a larger integrated system. So how can we build a building and a landscape around it and situate that within a larger college campus, within a town, in ways in which all of those sort of levels, those scales are sort of connected with each other. And I have to say, as someone who's now been at Oberlin for 20 years, I've really seen that vision play out. In 2000, the big green thing at Oberlin College was the Environmental Studies Center. People traveled, in fact, from all over the world to see this, this Environmental Studies Center, the Adam Joseph Lewis Center. But during my 20 years here, I've seen this progression with ripples kind of going out from the building. So within my first couple of years here at Oberlin, we moved from thinking about the building to thinking about the campus. And in 2003, we began developing a comprehensive environmental policy for Oberlin College that was passed by the faculty in 2007. And you read the sort of revision of that document from 2015. And so we really did sort of expand out from a building to thinking about the entire campus. We built a 2.3 megawatt solar array on the north end of campus. So whereas the solar array you see on the top of this building here, that was the largest solar array in Ohio for a decade. That is rated as a 59 kilowatt array. So think about 59 100 watt bulbs is what that panel, that is worth. The solar array on the north end of campus is 14 times larger than that solar array, but this was the biggest array in Ohio for a decade. It gives you a sense of like how rapidly the solar energy has evolved. That gigantic 10 acres of solar we have on the north end of campus, which I'll show you in another tour that I do later in the semester, is now it's not even the biggest array in Ohio. So you've just seen this massive growth in solar. And I think it points towards the reality that we really do have many of the technologies necessary to solve our problems right now. And again, this building was kind of like, David Orr sometimes refers to it as sort of the Kitty Hawk of green design, both because it was the first, but also because it has some of the kind of design flaws that you would expect in an early system. But at any rate, I wanted to make the point that the building is really part of a larger building landscape system, and we've seen these ripples go out. We talked early on in this class about how the town is now also very involved in sustainability. That wasn't true 20 years ago when this building was built. So we've seen those ripples going out to the college as a whole, into the town, and really the beginnings, I think, of a very powerful transformation with the sustainability plan you read for both the college and for the city at this point. So it may feel like the world is pretty dark at this particular moment, but there are the seeds of many very, very positive things that can happen. And as I mentioned in my email to you, I'm hoping that maybe this horrible moment in history that we're traveling through right now has at least the potential to be catalytic and allow us to see that we have the tools, and if we can just figure out how to work together positively, we can actually build a much better world. But I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. Let me go back to the AJLC and talk about some of the other features we see here. So I'm going to switch phones. Again, let me just actually stop for a second and see if anyone has any questions for me before I go on.
Is the largest solar array in Ohio now like a private electricity company, or?
That's a good question. I might turn that over to Ben Hobbs. I don't have any idea what the largest solar array is in Ohio at this point. Ben, do you have any thoughts on that?
So I'm in the process of looking it up because I had a feeling that question was going to be asked. I know just a couple of weeks ago, I believe, that there was a groundbreaking down towards Cincinnati for what will be the largest in Ohio, which is a 200 megawatt array. It's called the Hillcrest Solar Project. I believe that is some sort of connection to Duke Energy as the main, at least, taker of that electricity. Whether or not they own it, I'm uncertain. Other than that, Ohio really only has just under 300 megawatts of current installed capacity. So that would be an enormous addition. I believe the next closest one is somewhere in the 100 range up towards Toledo, but I actually don't know who owns it.
So if we have 300 megawatts of solar in Ohio, that means Oberlin is still probably about 1% of the total solar in Ohio. So we're still pretty significant. But I think it does raise a larger question about where solar is headed. The wonderful thing about solar is it is It can be a decentralized technology. I have solar on my house. Many people have solar on their houses in Oberlin. The solar on my house basically produces as much energy as I need to run the electrical appliances in my house and my electric car. But also, as your question suggests, Harrison, there's also a lot of grid, utility scale solar going on out there. But again, the nice thing about solar is it works both at the sort of residential and business scale, and it also works at that sort of grid level, as opposed to technologies like wind, which really only makes sense at a sort of utility scale. To build a wind turbine that makes economic sense, it's got to be really, really big. But I actually want to show you a different solar array. So I'm going to walk up to the building right now. Actually, I'll show you a couple things. And I want to say we're focused on solar arrays right now. But in fact, there are 3 different ways in which this building is capturing solar energy. So one way is through the solar panels. And here's a panel we put right down near ground level. So you could get a good look at a solar array. And I want to actually say a little bit more about this beautiful solar array in a second. But the other ways we're capturing solar energy is, you'll notice the whole building is designed on an east-west axis. That's intentional so that the building can capture a lot of solar energy, not just through the solar cells, but through the windows, so that we can get light energy into the building. And we can also use passive solar design. So we absorb heat within the building, we absorb light within the building, and it gets converted into heat. This building, compared to other buildings on the Oberlin College campus, only uses 23% as much energy in its lighting. And that's because it's such a well-lit building, because of the design of the windows on the south side, and also actually some on the upper north side, where most of us don't need to turn on our lights very often in our offices. So we've got the solar electrical, we've got the light and the heat coming into the building. And then the other way, of course, that this building and landscape are solar powered is all the plants, which are just beginning to sprout now. But I'm going to talk quite a bit about the plants in the landscape as well, which are, of course, capturing solar energy and doing interesting things with it. But the other thing I'll mention, and I'll switch cameras for a second here. The other thing I'll mention is this gnomon or sundial behind me. And I'm not sure if I can get a really good angle on this system. Let me see if I stretch my thing out a little bit. But yeah, I think you're seeing that big pole in the middle here. This is a giant sundial, but it's actually kind of an interesting sundial in the sense that it tracks not just hours of the day. If you look at the lines behind me in the cement, each one of those is sort of an hour of the day. So you can see, actually, let's go near so you can see the shadow coming off this thing. Can you guys see the shadow from the gnomon behind me? Yeah. So the cool thing about that shadow is it goes in a circle over the course of a day and tracks out day, but it also tracks seasons. You can see there are actually 3 arcs that it traverses. Let me switch cameras for a second and point at the arcs. Yeah. Okay, so you're seeing one arc here that the sun will travel along. It travels along that on the longest day of the year. So on June 21st, when the sun is high in the sky, that shadow here on the end of that gnomon will be traveling along that first arc. So that's the spring solstice. And then on the equinoxes, it travels along this next arch that you can see extending along here. And you can see we're sort of between the equinox and the solstice on this one. And then in the winter, when the sun is really low on the horizon, it'll travel along that arch that's closest to the building. And it's a pretty short arch because there's not that much sunlight on December 21st, which is when it would travel along that one. So it's kind of a neat sundial here, or gnomon. But I want to say one thing about it, which I think is kind of funny, which is when the architects built this, they weren't really thinking about the fact that we were near the western end of the Eastern time zone, and they just did sort of like a generic marking of time here. And so they're kind of off by most of an hour in their system because they just didn't account for the fact that we're on the western end of the Eastern time zone. So that's one of the warts in the building. I want to now take you to my one of my favorite technologies, which is this solar panel we have outside. So when I started and turned on the Zoom video earlier today, I had the waterfall inside the building flowing behind me, and I asked if you guys could see that waterfall. That waterfall is powered by this solar array out here. So all that noise in the center is, in a sense, you can think of it as the sound of sunlight falling on the building. And so on a day when it's really bright and sunny out here like today, we get a lot of water falling, and it's very noisy in that building. And if a cloud goes over the sun, you sort of see that, you hear that cloud going over the sun, because that pump that runs that solar sculpture is directly powered by this panel. Kind of a neat way of trying to connect people with solar resources. But the other thing I want to point out about this, this solar array out here is, unlike most modern solar arrays, this is a tracking panel, by the way, which means it tracks, it tilts and traces the sun over the course of a day. So it starts off pointed towards the east, and by the end of the day, it's pointed towards the west. Most tracking panels, including the one on the north end of campus, are controlled by a computer that kind of determines what their angle is based on a calculation of, you know, what the right angle is at that time of year. This is a passive tracker. So when we think about ecological design as being a way of designing systems that's based on nature, that sort of uses nature as a model, this solar panel is a lot more like a plant in the way it functions, because it tracks the sun, but it does it with absolutely no computer brain. And I want to explain to you how it works. If you look in this corner of the panel up here, can you see there's a black, I don't know what you're seeing, but yeah, there's a little black, basically bar. And that absorbs heat. There's a little metallic shield around it. And if I switch over to the other side of the ray, you'll see there's another one on this side. And then underneath this one, there's a kind of little black heat absorbing thing. And the way this thing works is liquid, so I'm walking underneath the panel now, liquid is pushed from one side of this panel to the other based on how those black bars and the black panel I showed you on this end are absorbing heat. So what's going to happen at the end of the day is all of the liquid will have been pushed into this side of the array, and so it'll be pointed all the way west. So it's just moving by gravity. And then in the morning, the eastern sun is going to fall on this little panel here, heat it up, push the liquid all the way back into this side. You can see there's this little tubing that it goes through from one side to the other. It'll push it to this side, and by gravity, the whole array will spin over to the east again and be pointed east, and then it'll start a whole nother cycle. So it's very much designed like a plant in the sense that its movement, its pointing towards light is based on, in the case of plants, it would be based on plant hormones, auxins that sort of redistribute. But in this case, it's just based on gravity. It's a passive feed. So it's a great example of how you can design of this field called biomimicry, where you basically design technologies so that they function like biological processes. So it's a very, very, very cool design. Biomimicry is, again, a field sort of within the field of ecological design, as is ecological engineering. All right, I'm going to stop for a second and see if anyone has any questions before I start talking about the wetland behind me.
I have a question. Are we gonna have
Cool.
time in the tour to see the lettuce?
I can show you the lettuce, so we can take special requests.
Okay,
So,
because
yes.
because I left campus, I'm like really wondering how it's doing. I'm a little worried about it.
I think the lettuce is okay, but I will show you the lettuce. You're
Okay.
talking about the lettuce you're talking about the lettuce inside the building, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions?
With the 23% of lighting, are you saying that's in comparison to other buildings as to how much it's using?
How much electricity is required per square foot to light the Lewis Center? It uses about 23% as much electricity. On average, it uses about 30% as much energy as a whole compared per square foot to other buildings on the Oberlin College campus. So yeah, good question. Other questions?
Does the environmental center use any other biomimicry
Yeah, the whole field of ecological design is really very closely related to biomimicry. So the whole concept of building a building that could capture solar energy, like plants, like ecosystems, that could internally recycle materials like ecosystems do, all of this is really essential to the idea of biomimicry. So the fields of ecological design, ecological engineering, and biomimicry are all just very much overlapping and part of the same thing. So yes, and I guess that's not a bad transition. Well, let me just see if there are other questions. Ben, do you have, I think it's easier for people to just talk than use, because I really don't see, those, like if someone types something in, it'll pop up, but I think the talking's working pretty well. So if you got questions, just say something, unmute and say something. Anyone have anything, any other questions?
Oh, where is the, so you're talking about how you can see when the cloud passes over, but obviously the rest of the solar array has some energy storage. Where does that happen? So like through the night and everything?
Really, really good question that I'm glad you asked, because I'd meant to talk about that. So one of the things I think we need to think really hard about when we think about ecological design, and I think this is becoming clear with our whole sort of like health situation right now, is it's really important to think about when it makes sense to design systems that are internally self-reliant, that can be cut off from the larger world and function, and when it makes sense to design systems that are fundamentally integrated with the larger world. So I think one of the challenges I think we're seeing playing out now in terms of the national response to the COVID virus is we have at some level, I think we see some really great responses at the state level, but we don't see the kind of responses at the national level that we need in order to create an integrated solution. That might seem like a really strange way to talk about solar, but I'm going to make the connection now. This building is grid interconnected. That means when solar energy is produced on the roof of this building, it's exported direct when there's more solar energy produced on the roof of the building than the building is using, which would be the case right now. It's producing much more electricity than it's using. That power is just exported right back out onto the grid. So I don't know if you can see this, but across the street from me, there's a normal set of power lines running down the street. Those power lines are connected to all the buildings around here, and they're connected to the Lewis Center. And when the Lewis Center is producing more energy, it goes right back out onto those power lines. Now, you could say it would add a certain element of resilience if we stored energy within the building, so that if something bad happened within the grid, we could still run the building. But there's a cost. There's always a cost to that sort of local self-reliance. In this case, if you think about it, the most efficient batteries are probably only about 60% efficient at converting electricity into stored energy, and then only about 60% efficient at converting stored energy into electrical energy. And so they're only about 36% efficient overall, which means you lose a lot of the useful energy in the process of storing it. Whereas if you put it right out onto the grid, you're immediately displacing brown forms of power like coal-fired power. So from an ecological standpoint, although it would give us resilience to store energy internally, from a larger societal perspective, there's more value in terms of reducing the amount of fossil fuel-based power if we export it out onto the grid. So this raises this much larger question that I think all of us need to think deeply about. There's obviously a local foods movement. There's all sorts of movement. There's all sorts of developments within the environmental movement towards localization of a lot of things. And I think localization is great, but there's a lot of situations in which high degrees of localization actually decrease efficiency. So there's a real balance to be struck here, and something that we really need to think about. So that's a very, very deep question you actually asked there. Other questions? All right, I'm going to continue my tour. What you can see behind me, I hope, is the wetland system for this building. And one of the core principles of ecological design that I haven't yet mentioned is the idea of stacking function. So ideally, when you design something right, it actually has several different functions, not just one function. So the wetland you see behind me, which will look absolutely stunningly beautiful in a couple weeks when things really start to bloom. And by the way, if I was here at night, it would be deafening behind me. What would be making all the noise? I might not be able to, you might not be able to hear me at night. Why?
Frogs?
Yeah, the frogs are going absolutely nuts right now, and they'll be going absolutely nuts tonight. For some reason, they don't make so much noise. They tend to do it around dawn and dusk, but it would be very noisy here at night. But the stacked function for this particular wetland is, the goal was to produce something that helped connect people with this place. We've talked about the fact that, that Northeast Ohio used to be basically forested wetlands. It also had some open wetlands like this. And when the settlers came, they cut most of it down. We've lost 90% of our wetlands. So part of the goal in building this wetland was to create a repository for native species diversity, the kinds of plants that were quite important in this landscape a long time ago. So we've done a lot of work to plant this wetland with native species. We actually do a lot of work that, that Ben could probably reflect on in trying to remove invasive species, which are often more aggressive than native species. But we stock this thing with lots of native species to make it a repository for species diversity. But the other sort of very engineering-oriented function this has is that this is a stormwater retention basin. So when it rains, the water from the roof is channeled into this wetland here, and the water from many parts of the landscape are also channeled into this wetland. So most urban landscapes, when it rains heavily, that water goes pretty much directly into the street, paved surfaces, and goes into the river system, and basically results in this huge pulse of water in the river system, oftentimes with associated pollutants that are on the road surface. And that's really bad for the natural ecosystems. So by having this sort of urban stormwater retention swale here, we reduce that from happening. So again, it's got these double functions of being a repository for biodiversity and also providing a stormwater retention basin for us. I'm going to walk over to this lovely maple tree for a second here, because I just want to see if you can see these beautiful flowers. Can you guys see that flower there? You see there's a fly on this flower, actually. Can you guys see that? Thumbs up?
Yeah.
Yeah, this is maples were a dominant species. This particular form of maple is designed to grow tall and narrow. We're using it to try to shade the eastern side of the building, which gets too much sunlight. And so these trees actually have a functional purpose beyond just providing beauty. Maples are wind-pollinated species, so they don't have very showy flowers, although they are very pretty. Although it looks like flies may have some involvement, but they're wind-pollinated in general, so that they don't really rely on insects to pollinate them. All right, I'm going to walk around the wetland here. We rebuilt this wetland a couple of years back and created this lovely space in here with the thought that people might teach classes out here or do concerts, and people really haven't done that. So if you guys are, I know some of you, I've learned that some of you are performers, and it's a great little concert venue right here when you get back to Oberlin. I'm going to show you one other sort of flower, which is, you're seeing last year's seed pods here. Can you guys see these? You can see that okay? All right, so I'll walk back from it. You can see it. Does anyone know what plant that is? Do we have any plant people in the audience here? It's a native species. It's actually in the hibiscus family. It's absolutely beautiful flowers. That plant is a marshmallow. And I know you're saying, what a marshmallow? That sounds like marshmallow. Well, if you break the stem of that in the spring, it has this sort of mucilaginous material that oozes out of the stem. And the original marshmallows were made by taking that stuff and whipping it together with sugar. You could make marshmallows out of it. So the marshmallow actually comes originally from the marshmallow. Now it's made with gelatin. It has nothing to do with those things, but it was vegan back then. Oh, hold on, I'm going to show you some other flowers. You can see our daffodils are just starting to come up there. All right, I'm going to keep walking around the building. What you see behind me here on this side is, and you'll be amused that I say this, it was designed to serve as sort of a forest for the center. And we used to have a whole understory here, but that understory really didn't develop the way we wanted to. We are still planting some You can see we've got some new little plants in here, but it was really too small to function as a forest. But all of the species in this little area here are all native species of Ohio. Yeah. So I'm continuing my walk around the building and over to, I guess your, how does that work? Left is sort of the living machine. We're going to do another tour of the living machine later in the semester, so I'm not going to say that much about that, except to say that that system condenses and amplifies wetland processes that are specifically useful for treating waste. And so, whereas the wetland out here has these dual functions of stormwater retention and native biodiversity, the wetland in there has the function of treating wastewater. Also got some raspberries planted against the edge of the building there that you can see. So I'm walking to the north side of the building, and I'm going to talk about some of the features on this part of the building. All right, so maybe I'll mention, I'm going to say a little bit more about hazelnuts. And so while I'm showing you flowers, I'll show you hazelnut flowers. Can you guys see those little flowers blowing in the wind there? This is what a hazelnut flower looks like. Hazelnuts are also wind pollinated. The wind pollinated plants do their thing much earlier than the insect pollinated plants, so they're kind of blooming now. So what you're looking at now behind me is the north side of the building. And in other parts of the country, solar architecture oftentimes involves building buildings into the sides of hills. And part of the reason for that is the earth itself provides a very good insulation from the environment. Of course, in Ohio, we're challenged in terms of our hills. So what we did here was to pile earth up against the north side of this building to sort of block the loss of heat from the building on the north side. And again, when we think about ecological design as being focused on stacking multiple functions together, we've got the insulating properties and thermal mass, the sort of storage of heat properties of this earth on this side, but it also provided an opportunity for us to build an orchard. So the trees behind you, behind me right now, are mostly apple trees. There are a couple other, there's some pear trees behind me too. Actually, I'll turn around, those are pear trees right there. And in a good year, we'll get quite a bit of fruit, organic fruit, that gets donated to Oberlin Community Services down the road here, and also eaten by Oberlin students as well. But so again, this idea of you can produce a lot of food actually within an urban landscape. Yeah. Now I'm going to show you another urban garden that has multiple functions to it. So behind me right now is something that has double functions. What you can see is sort of like kind of a household scale organic garden. Let me see if anything's sprouting in here right now.
You might get some garlic.
Is anything planted? You want to interrupt me and say something about the garden?
If you go to the very first straw all the way towards the solar array, you might see some garlic popping up, but that's going to be the only thing that would be in the ground so far.
I'm afraid I do not see garlic popping up.
Check the one behind you just in case. You
know what? I see one rogue garlic plant here. Either that or a leek. I can't really tell. They're in the same family. Can you guys see that? There's a leek right here, or garlic. Probably garlic.
Yeah, I believe it's garlic.
They're both in the onion family.
I know we have a lot of garlic planted. I just don't remember exactly which bed it's in.
Yeah, there's like a Brussels sprout plant behind me that somehow made it through the winter. I don't know how.
There's rhubarb that will be coming up in not too long, but there's like 7 or 8 of them around the corner. But
yeah. All right, so let me talk about stacked function here in this garden. So this is a garden, but actually underneath this garden is a key engineering component of this building. And that is there's a series of 3 lines, each of which has 8 wells in it. And these wells extend down into the ground 240 feet. So there's there's approximately 2 miles of tubing that is going all through the soil underneath this garden bed. And I want someone to try to answer the question, why the heck do we have 2 miles of tubing extending multiple times deep into the ground here? And I'll give you a hint, we are not extracting water from those wells. In fact, all that tubing it doesn't even connect with the water down there. It just sort of circulates through the soil. What is that about? Does anyone have any guesses on that?
Heating?
Heating. Did you say heating? Is that you, Harson?
Yeah.
Yes, that is, that's part of the heating system for the building. So as many of you know, once you get down into the soil temperature remains relatively constant once you get a few feet below the surface. About 50 degrees it stays for the entire year once you get a good 10 feet down. And that tubing is all about exchanging heat. It's a giant heat exchanger. And I want to explain this in a way that's going to make sense to you. I think most of you know that if you look at the backside of a refrigerator, it's got all these coils on it. And if you touch those coils, they're warm. So you probably had that experience. If you haven't had the experience, take a look behind a refrigerator. Usually there's a big set of coils behind that refrigerator. A refrigerator is a heat pump. And what it does is it pumps heat from inside the refrigerator into the outside behind the refrigerator. It extinguishes the heat through those coils. Well, this building is heated with what we call a ground source heat pump. People often also call it a geothermal system. I find that a little bit misleading because when I think of geothermal, I usually think of like tapping into the deep heat of the earth. This is geothermal in the sense that it's tapping into that heat of the earth, but it's not a lot of heat. It's tapping into the heat of the 50-degree soil that's below the surface. And so in the winter, what this building does is it takes heat from all those pipes in the ground, and it pumps that heat from the ground into the building. And then in the summertime, it takes heat from inside the building and pumps it back into the ground. But it's the same principle as your refrigerator, where it pumps from one side of the refrigerator, the inside of the refrigerator, into the outside of the refrigerator, except this particular system is reversible, so that in the summer, you can pump heat out of the building into the ground, and in the winter, you can pump heat from the ground into the building. The reason this building has a ground source heat pump or geothermal heating system is it's a way of very efficiently heating with electricity. So you can easily turn electricity into heat. Your toaster does that, for instance. It's 100% efficient at turning electricity into heat energy. But the thing about a heat pump is an efficient heat pump can develop a whole lot more heat transfer than unit of electricity. So let me explain that. For 1 unit of electricity, you can get 4 units of heat energy pumped if it's an efficient heat pump system. So one of the goals when this building was built was to build an all-electric building so that it could be powered entirely by the solar arrays. And so a heat pump is a very, very efficient way of heating with electricity. And I mentioned earlier that the building has a grid integrated solar system. And what that means is in the winter, when there's not that much sunlight and it's not producing that much electricity, we import a lot of electricity off the grid to heat the building. But in the summer, when we're not using that much electricity in the building and when there's lots of solar energy, we export a lot of electricity back out onto the grid. On balance, this building is designed to produce more total electricity with its solar array than it uses within the building. But over the course of the year, in the winter, it's importing energy, and in the summer, it's exporting energy. So again, it goes back to that issue we talked about being connected with the larger world. Around here, given the electricity in our mix, it's actually a very good balance for our electrical mix, because around here, the highest electricity use periods of the year are in the summer, because people are using that electricity for air conditioning. So this building is delivering electricity to the grid when electricity is most expensive and hardest to produce. So it's actually very valuable the way it integrates. Are there any questions? Let me stop there for a second before I totally shift gears.
I have a question about weather.
Yeah.
I know actually when I was a first year, so last year, I would go ice skating a lot on the AGLC ponds, and I noticed the water level was very high that year. But this year, the water level was too low in the winter for like me to even skate on it. Like, and the pipes were like all sticking like probably 3 or 4 feet above the water surface level. I was wondering, just like in terms of like last year versus this year, I know you mentioned the spring was very wet last year, but like what for this year would contribute to such like a low water level in the wetland system?
That's a really good question. And one of the most, I think I had you read a piece by Amory Lovins as one of the first, I think for the first class. Amory's an expert in energy technologies. But when he talks about climate change, he calls it global weirding, because weird things are happening. And it was a very wet spring, and it was a pretty dry fall. I have a pond at my own house, and it's overflowing by early fall, and it experienced the same thing that our pond at the AJLC experienced. So I'm inclined to attribute it just to, variability that we're experiencing in weather. Rowan, are you having trouble hearing? I think I just saw a message there. Am I coming through okay?
It sounds like it. I'll read it for you. It says it's loud where she is, so she can't unmute. But her question is, does it end up creating enough energy during the summer to offset what it has to take from the grid in the winter? And does it still end up with positive energy?
Well, since you're on that one, Ben, why don't you say a couple words about that?
Of course. So I've been here now 4 years, and in the 2 to 3 years before I was here, we could confidently say that we were in fact producing enough energy in the summer to offset our annual production. We've had an inverter go down inside the main AJLC building. There's 3 of them in there, and one of them has basically ceased to function. So as we go through the replacement of that, the roof array is producing a little bit less than it has been by about a third. And then, John, this will come as news to you, but I just learned about this the other day as well. We had chipmunks tunnel into one of the buried connection areas over behind the compost bin and chewed through some electric lines from the main array over the garage. So our production is a little bit lower than where it has been, but we typically end up with positive energy, yes.
Yeah, Ben, alas, that's not news to me, at least not as of
Oh, no.
earlier today, because I was going to show graphs of our solar performance today because I knew it would be so outstanding. This, by the way, is the perfect weather for solar production. You don't actually, you'd think that you would peak on June 21st when the sun is highest in the sky, but actually our peak in solar production is typically sometime in May, and that's because photovoltaic cells are actually sensitive to temperature, and a cold solar array in good light produces more than a warm solar array in good light. And so normally this would be like the absolutely perfect day for solar production, but alas, for reasons that Ben has now explained to me, we're producing 0 solar energy right now. And unfortunately, this is at a time when I think it's unlikely we're going to get it fixed super quickly, although I hope you're submitting the work orders for it.
Our Art has been on it every day since I've been there, so.
Art is one of our campus electricians, really wonderful guy. He was involved in installing a lot of the monitoring equipment we'll talk about later in this course, but I just saw him in the building earlier today. All right, I'm going to shift gears completely and talk a little bit about what's behind me here, which doesn't look, or was there a question?
Yeah, so you said that most of our heating for the Lewis Center is provided through that heat pump. If the ground soil is like around like 50 degrees, how does the building get any warmer than 50 degrees?
Good question.
Right, that is a very, very good question. And that is the nature of the heat pump. So this is a thermodynamic apparatus that what it does, and I don't want to go into the details of it, like the explanation I gave of, I think that was Zach, by the way, I couldn't see you, but I think I'm recognizing your voice. That is it's a process where you put electricity in. Well, let me try to explain how it works very briefly without getting too complicated on it. It's like a refrigerator in the sense you're pumping heat from inside the refrigerator to outside the refrigerator, right? The way it does it is by compressing a gas. When you compress a gas, if for those of you who've had chemistry recently or physics, there's the universal gas law, PV equals nRT. As you compress gas, as you make your volume smaller, something has to give and it gives off heat. So where you compress the gas, you generate heat. And then where you let that gas expand, you absorb heat. And so what any heat pump is doing is it's compressing gas in a place where you want to give off the heat, and then it's allowing that gas to expand in a place in which you want to absorb heat. So it just reverses those processes. But basically the reason it's called a heat pump is because there's actually a pump that does that compression, that does the compression cycle. So you're putting electricity in order to move heat from one place to another. But what it allows you to do is you can move heat from a place that, as you say, is pretty cold to some place where you want to deliver that heat, but you can make something much warmer than the temperature that you're delivering it from, but you're cooling the ground down in the process. So we actually have temperature sensors installed around the water that comes to and from the ground loop, and you can measure how we're taking heat out of that 51 degrees Celsius. So by the end of the winter, that ground is actually much colder than 50 degrees because we've extracted heat from it, if that makes sense. It's physics. Physics and thermodynamics, but yeah. Ponder your refrigerator because it's doing the same thing. All right, so I'm gonna say something about what's behind me right now. A couple minutes ago, I showed you some blooming hazelnuts, which are next to Harkness. That was a project by an Oberlin student a couple years ago, wanting to build more edibles into the landscape. Here in the Lewis Center, obviously we've had quite a focus on building edibles into the landscape. This area behind me is an experimental hazelnut orchard. So we have planted a very biodiverse variety. It's actually not a variety, it's many different varieties of hazelnuts. And what we're trying to do is experiment with the question of, can you grow significant amounts of food on trees? And obviously the answer is yes, people grow nut trees. But in this particular area of the country, as you probably know, and as we'll talk about more later, our principal crops are corn and soybeans. And as we've also discussed, corn and soybeans require a lot of tilling of the soil. Corn at least requires a lot of fertilizer. Soybeans require phosphorus fertilizer. They'll fix their own nitrogen fertilizer. But the point is, traditional agriculture actually has an enormous ecological cost. A lot of fossil fuels is used to run the material, a lot of soil erosion. It creates a lot of problems and is generally not sustainable over the long term. So this experimental orchard is kind of the beginnings of an assessment of, could we potentially grow a lot of calories, food materials, on trees in this particular area. So we've got a bunch of different experiments going on here, which I might not have time to really explain today. But suffice it to say that all of those flags you're seeing out there mark different sort of soil samplings. We're trying to determine whether we can sequester carbon within the soil here. So use this hazelnut crop not only to produce food, but also to store carbon from the atmosphere within plant biomass, and more importantly than that, here within the soil. So I can talk about that more later. Actually, I'll show you some of the wood we harvested. I'll tell you a little bit about the experiment. So these trees behind us were harvested just a couple months ago. You can see the tops of the trees stored under the solar array here. With hazelnuts, the way you manage the crop is you cut the trees down to the ground every few years, and then they resprout and grow back up again. And it's called coppicing. And what we're trying to do here is, you can see them bundled up right here. They're tied up in bundles with organic rope. And what we're gonna do is chop these into pieces, and then we're gonna make charcoal out of them through a process, it's called biochar. We're gonna make biochar out of them. And that biochar is something that does not decompose in the soil. So if you put that into the soil, a lot of people are advancing that as one of the ways we could store a lot of the atmospheric carbon in farm soils and make them more fertile at the same time. If you're interested in this sort of biological stuff, I'll do a little promo for my systems ecology course, in which we do lots of research on this hazelnut experiment here. And we've had a couple good honors theses come out of this hazelnut orchard as well. I think I only booked an hour and I'm already over. Well, I'm not quite over yet, but let me go into the building and say a couple things about some of the technology in here. I want to just show you these handholds. I just walked into the door of the building, and one of the things we did a few years back is we took water coming from the ground loop and going back into the ground loop and sent it through these handles at the west entrance of the building. And if you feel these two handles together, I can't hold them at the same time and hold my camera, but you'll notice a temperature difference. And the temperature difference you feel between these two handles here is the amount of heat that's being pumped out of the ground right now into the building, because we're still in the heating cycle right now. So I can feel this one's very cold and this one's warm. So this is the one that is going back into the ground loop. This is coming from the ground loop. So you can basically feel the heat we've pumped into the building through those two handles there. I'm going to show you a couple things that almost no one gets to see, except Ben. This is our mechanical room in here. So we're walking into the mechanical room, and hopefully the light will adjust now. And what you're seeing behind me is lots and lots of pipes. And actually these two boxes that I think you can see behind me are water-to-water heat pumps. So those particular heat pumps are what heats the floor of the atrium in this building. They probably aren't on right now because the floor doesn't need any heating right now. We used to sort of heat that floor. This contraption above my head right here that you can see is an energy recovery ventilation system, an ERV. It's used to extract heat in the ventilation air so that we can ventilate this building without using a lot of that heat energy. And then you see lots and lots of piping around me. Those feed 27 different heat pumps that are installed throughout the building that deliver all the heat to this building. Make sure I get the lights up before I leave here. I'm gonna go off. There we go. I'll show you one more room, which is normally a really noisy room, but for reasons that Ben has explained, it's not noisy right now. This is our photovoltaic equipment room. And normally it'd be really loud in here because this is where the energy coming off of the solar panels on the roof is delivered to the Lewis Center. Actually, you can see a couple broken solar panels behind me. These are actually not from our roof. These are our parking lot solar panels. But these contraptions, these white boxes behind me here, are called inverters. And those inverters are necessary to convert the electricity from direct current electricity, which is how it's delivered when it first gets converted, to alternating current electricity, which is what is used in buildings. Nowadays, and Ben knows far more about this than I do because he was involved in the solar industry before he came to work for us. Nowadays, they have like these microinverters that are oftentimes on the roof. And so you don't have these big inverters. These are ancient history, these things. They're very first generation. If you wanted to program those things, you'd need to have a DOS-based computer. This is our new one that's replacing the broken one. The other thing I'll show you in here is our data monitoring system. One of the things we set out to do was to extensively monitor this building. So this contraption that you're looking at in here is our part of our first generation 1 data logging system. We installed over 150 sensors throughout the building and landscape to basically measure all aspects of building function. You can see all those wires going in here, all of the major electrical circuits in the building. This is sort of generation 2 data logger here that we're trying to transition all of our data loggers to these. That's monitoring most of the electricity flows that take place within the building. So giving you the real back view. Lights off. All right. You know what? I have lots more I could say, but I want to stop for questions, and then I'll call it quits. I'll leave this screen behind us, which is showing water use You can see this is our monitoring, our display of our monitoring system. I think someone flushed the toilet once today. That's what you're seeing on that one. But let's go ahead and switch to questions. You guys have any questions for me?
Yeah, I had a quick question going back to the wetland system.
Yeah.
I was wondering if it had anything to do with filtration. I'm pretty familiar with the idea of like a, what's it called, like a bioswale, and like the
Right.
filtration that happens, bioswale,
Right.
yeah, the way that it, like filtration happens with that system. Is the wetland system doing any type of filtration, or does that happen separately at the center?
So that is a very, very good question. And the answer to that is yes, it's doing surface filtration. So when water flows from the surrounding landscape and passes through all of that plant material on the edge of the wetland, that wetland, it's just like we talked about in that first case study, that all of those wetland plants are processing the water that travels through them, taking out nutrients. They allow larger particles to settle so that the water that overflows from that wetland is much, much cleaner than other water. So it does surface filtration. I think partly what you're talking about, though, is the use of wetlands, bioswales, as a means of purifying groundwater. So in this particular case, there are two reasons why this wetland is not really cleaning groundwater. One is that this wetland was built on the site of a bunch of old college buildings and stuff. And so basically we had to line the wetland with a rubber membrane. So it doesn't actually, the water from there can't actually go into the groundwater because it's actually separated from the groundwater with a membrane. But the other piece of that is, as you guys I think kind of know, Ohio soils are so dense in terms of being clay soils that water doesn't really travel through the clay anyways. There's less of that recharge of groundwater here than you would be experiencing in other bioswales. But it has all of the surface functions of cleaning water. I hear someone trying to talk. Questions?
I have a quick question. I was wondering, so in terms of kind of the planning behind the environmental studies building, was there kind of a meeting that took place between people, or I guess professors, in the environmental studies, or like who work in environmental studies, or like how did it kind of come to be? Did somebody in particular kind of come up with this idea of coming up with an environmental sustainable, like sustainable building? Or I guess I'm just kind of curious, like how kind of the details came to be and were worked out, if that makes sense.
That's a wonderful question, and all credit for this Environmental Studies Center really goes to my colleague David Orr, whose paper one of his papers you read for today. So the process really started in sort of the mid-1990s. I arrived at Oberlin College as a faculty member. Well, I left as a student in 1988, and then I came back as a faculty member in 2000. And all of the design work on this building occurred while I was elsewhere. But David really wanted to use this as a learning process, the entire design process. So he invited sort of the cutting edge thinkers in green design from around the country to come in and engage in what are called design charrettes with students. And he conducted several different sets of classes in which students would work with these design professionals from around the country to sort of think through and develop the design program for this building. So it was a wonderful process that they engaged in. At the end of the day, there was the issue of convincing Oberlin College that this should happen, which I think is part of your question. And what David Orr got the then president Fred Starr to agree to was that if David could raise all of the money for this building from people who had never given to Oberlin and were unlikely to give to Oberlin, then basically the president said, you can raise money for this building. And David, who is amazing in many, many ways, it is quite an astounding fundraiser, very quickly raised $7 million to build this building. So that's a very short version of the story. He actually wrote a wonderful book called Design on the Edge, which talks about the process of designing and building this building. It's an absolutely wonderful book, Design on the Edge by David Orr.
have a question regarding the economics, and I'm just curious what the price tag difference would be, disregarding the green incentives, and how much of a disincentive it would be for others looking to have something similar.
That's a really, really good question. This building was expensive to build. There were a number of technologies that were incorporated into this building, like the living machine, which I haven't talked about, but it's the internal system for treating and internally recycling water within the building. We're going to do a whole tour of the living machine, which is why I'm not focusing on that right now. But because we built a bunch of things into it, which really were principally for education, it was a pretty expensive building to build per square foot relative to other buildings. David actually does a lot of calculations on that in his book. And if you subtract out those sort of additional features, you could have built a building that had sort of the ecological functional value of this for a price tag that was pretty similar to the cost of a traditional building. But the enormous difference, of course, is the money you save over time because you're not using all the energy to heat the building. So obviously one of the fundamental problems of our current economic system is that it focuses on short-term costs and benefits rather than long-term costs and benefits. When you do full life cycle assessment or full cost accounting, when you consider, how much it's going to cost to heat the building over time, and then when you really begin to expand your system's thinking on this and think about what about the cost of the ecological damage that comes from using materials that can't be recycled, materials that cause harm to people elsewhere. When you begin to incorporate those things into your thinking about the costs of the building, this building becomes very inexpensive. But of course, for someone who's low income, and I think we're seeing a lot of this with electric cars, for instance, it's like, well, if you don't have very much money, you can't afford to buy a more expensive vehicle that's an electric vehicle, even if it's going to save you money over time. And so this really gets into this whole question about how do we rethink the economy so that we align short-term and long-term incentives. So it's not actually such an easy question to answer. I will say that there are obviously economies of scale. When this building was built, to install a solar panel, the roof solar panels cost over $6 a watt. You rate these solar panels based on how many watts they can produce in their maximum when they have maximum sunlight on them. This thing costs about $6 a watt to install on the roof, and about $10 a watt for the solar panels over the parking lot. The reason no one else was installing solar panels at that time was because they were just absolutely cost prohibitive. We did an analysis and determined that even within the life cycle of these solar panels, they could never pay themselves back economically because they were just too expensive at the time. Now it actually makes economic sense to install solar panels. The price is cut more than in half. I actually just looked up earlier today the cost of solar panels per watt in Ohio. It's at $3 a watt right now for home scale solar arrays, probably a lot less for utility scale solar arrays. So it's dropped more than half the price, and it is now economically sensible to do this. But we really need to build in the full set of incentives and full life cycle assessment into our whole governmental system so that people are incentivized to do things that make ecological sense, and so that the cost is not prohibitively expensive for low-income people to do the right thing. Any other questions?
I had a question about just the walls. What kind of material are you using in the walls to keep good insulation and everything?
Right, so I haven't talked as much about the materials in the building as I had intended. The steel in this building is all recycled. The wood is all from sustainably harvested forest, most from Pennsylvania. But I'm pointing right now at the windows to say, this is, I think, one of the very first buildings to use triple pane windows so that they have much higher insulation value than most windows. One of the things I'll point at here is one of the sort of warts of the building. that device that opens and closes the building, you can see there's sort of like a gear shaft right there that's designed to open and close the buildings. And that's one of the things that they didn't quite get right from an engineering perspective. They'd never built opening and closing windows that were triple pane, and they didn't calculate in the weight properly, so the things stripped their gears all the time. But the space is designed to ventilate really well, so that these windows down here will open in cool nights in the summer and spring. And then if you look behind me, there's a whole set of those windows in the upper part of the building up there. And so you can open both of those windows and you get this whole convective circuit of air to cool the place. And if you open them at night when it's cool and then you shut them in the morning, you can keep this cooler without having to use the same cooling energy. The external walls, I already pointed out behind the building that we have that berm against the building. And then on the parts of the building that are not windows, we have sort of a double insulated wall with insulation between an interior brick wall and an exterior brick wall. That answer your question, Harrison? All right, any last questions before we wrap this up? All right, well,
I think Isabel's trying to say something, but she might be muted.
I'm muted.
Isabel, unmute yourself. Hi.
Hi. How does the energy used in production of the LC factor into its sustainability and its ecological footprint?
Isabel, I'm going to repeat your question because I could barely hear it, but I think I got it. And I think the question was a very, very important question, which is how did the energy used in building the building factor into our consideration of its sort of design? Is that, did I get your question right?
Yeah. So
we haven't done full cost accounting for all components of the building, but in the early aughts, I think it was 2003, I had a student named Michael Murray who worked with me on doing an assessment of the rooftop solar array, which was designed to answer that question for the solar array. Very interesting study in which we looked at 3 different currencies. So we considered how long would it take for the solar panels to produce as much energy as had been used in making the solar cells and installing the solar cells. How long would it take before those would have prevented as much dioxide being released into the atmosphere as was released in production and installation of those? And then how long would it take for them to pay back financially? And it was a very interesting study because we found it paid back those 3 currencies at different time periods. It paid back the, and I'm not going to get the numbers totally right now because it's not fresh in my head, but my recollection is, I know the order in which it paid back. It paid back CO2 fastest. And that turned out to be an interesting story because it turns out that the solar panels were manufactured in parts of the world that use less coal-powered electricity than Ohio does. And because when they produce electricity in Ohio, they were displacing coal-fired power, they paid back CO2 very rapidly. In the course of, I think, 4 or 5 years, they were paying back all of the CO2 that had been emitted. And from then on, the solar panels you can think of as being like trees. They're essentially causing CO2 not to enter the atmosphere, right? They paid back electricity a couple years later. And as I already mentioned, because they were very expensive to install, our estimate was they would not pay back financially. Obviously, they had a lot of educational value, so they paid back in other ways. Today's solar panels, on the other hand, pay back financially very quickly. In fact, I installed solar panels because I'm, an enviro geek, but the reality is they're actually a decent financial investment for me. But again, for all these, the question you're asking is really profound, and it fits into what I'm referring to as full cost or life cycle assessment, costing of things, where you think about what did it cost to do that. And I think the first ecological design principle I introduced was this notion of what's the effect of what you do here on elsewhere and at some later time? So that's really ecological design thinking you're entering into with that question. That's exactly the kind of question you need to ask. All right, well, it's been great to see you. I love the questions you asked me, and I look forward to engaging with you next week.